So I'd like to echo Harold's thanks to the organisers and for you all for coming. It's a real honour to be invited. I think, actually though, to start, I have to make an apology and a confession. So my apology is that I'm not Celia Hayes. I'm also not Caroline Katmer, Richard Cook or Claire Press. Most of the work I'm going to be talking about was developed in strong collaboration with those people, and probably all of them could give a better talk than I can, but I'll try and do justice to them. My big confession is that I'm not really sure why I'm here, and also not sure why you're all here either. And the reason why is because I actually think mirror neurons are quite boring. So you can see, Vittorio made nice, modest claims. I'm going to make big ones and hopefully start a fight. The reason why I think mirror neurons are boring is I think that it was always going to be the case that we had them. From what we know about the way humans behave and about the way that animals behave, we're always going to find mirror neurons. It was great that they were found, of course, but I wasn't very surprised that we did find them. And what we've all been working on really is how we have mirror neurons. Where do they come from? And the theory that I'm going to briefly outline is something called the associative sequence learning theory. And this is potentially the most simple, boring, obvious theory in the world. And the big idea behind it is actually very, very simple. The big idea is just that we can associate stimuli with responses. Nothing more than that. So humans, animals, can learn to associate a stimulus with a response. If you buy that, then I think we're all on the same page. So just to illustrate how this idea can give you mirror neurons, let's take a different example. Let's take this lady here. She's about to start an intensive driving course, so she can't drive at all at the moment. And we're neuroscientists. We're interested in the neuroscience of driving. And so we put her on a road, and she's driving along, and the car in front turns its brake lights on. She's a novice driver. She hasn't learned the association between seeing brake lights and immediately pressing the brake. So when we show the brake lights and we record from a neuron in her premotor cortex, for instance, there's no response whatsoever. She hasn't learned that you need to press the brake as soon as you see a brake light of the car in front. We measure the response when she presses her own brake pedal, and we see the neuron fires. This is very clear then. This is a motor neuron. It doesn't respond to sensory events, does respond to executed actions. We keep recording from this neuron and from the same person, and we record after 5 days. So this is the same person after 5 days, and her course was brilliant. She's passed her test. She's an expert driver. We now put her on the road, and when she's driving, she sees the brake lights of the car in front light. She's now an experienced driver. She knows when you see the brake lights, you need to prepare to press the brake and start to press the brake. So now, when she sees the brake lights, this neuron fires. It also still fires when she presses the brake herself. So this neuron, exactly the same neuron, and exactly the same person, that before was a motor neuron, and it definitely was a motor neuron, is now a sensory motor neuron. And to me, this seems absolutely clear. If you can associate a stimulus with a response, and we're recording from a neuron that causes you to execute that response, then when you see the stimulus, it will start to fire. So I'm sure you can all see where I'm going with this, but let's think about mirror neurons. So let's imagine the system in its natural state. It's when you're born, basically. Let's imagine we've got a population of neurons, maybe somewhere like the STS. I hesitate to say STS with Dave here, because I'm likely to mess something up. But let's imagine it's somewhere like the STS. And these populations of neurons may be tuned to particular actions, for instance. So this one might be opening your hand, this one might be grasping, this one might be closing your hand. And all of these populations are purely sensory. So let's say they're visual, for instance. And in somewhere like the premotor cortex, you've got 3 populations of neurons, and they're purely motor. So when these fire, you perform actions. So this one potentially might be opening your hand, this one might be holding something, this one might be closing your hand. And the important point is, at the start, the initial state of the system is that all of these populations of neurons are weakly but non-systematically connected to these populations of neurons. So, for instance, it's no more likely that the site, the population of neurons coding for the site of a hand opening, is more connected to the performance of a hand opening than of holding or closing. There is no systematic matching relationship between these. So, you're born, no connections, you have no mirror neurons. You have motor neurons and perceptual neurons. Then the infant's lying in its crib, and it's doing things like this, just performing hand actions, and at the same time it's watching its hand actions. And every single time, for instance, that the infant does this with their hand, they get this population of neurons active. This population of neurons is coding for hand opening. At the same time, they're watching their own hand open. So you're getting correlated experience, sensory motor experience, of the execution and the observation of hand opening. Now, it kind of should be no surprise to anybody that if you get correlated experience of a stimulus and a response, you develop an associative link between them. So these two things become bidirectionally associated. And so, after learning, what we find is that the motor neurons now become mirror neurons because they are associated with the sensory neurons coding for that action. Now, hopefully this really shouldn't be controversial. The fact that you can link a stimulus and a response should be, I mean, I don't know who would argue with this. And I think what often is kind of maybe unappreciated is this would turn things that were purely motor into mirror neurons. Now, the kind of little story I've told you about the infant watching its own hands is absolutely fine. But what about things like facial actions? You can't see your own facial actions. Well, then we need some other thing. We need another way to provide the correlated sensory motor experience. Luckily enough, a big source of this is the fact that parents imitate their children. So when, for instance, the child makes a smile, the adult tends to smile back. When the child frowns, the adult tends to frown back. This will give you correlated sensory motor experience. It will do exactly what hand observation would do. And it will turn motor neurons to mirror neurons. Also the case that watching yourself interact in a mirror will give you exactly the same experience. Also, things like dance training, sports training, where you act in conjunction with other people, or common reactions to external events. If the child smells something disgusting, usually the child actually made a disgusting smell, and they kind of make a disgusted reaction, or they taste something disgusting, and the parent also smells the smell and makes a disgusted face, they're going to get this correlated sensory motor experience. So what's interesting is that in this model, the mirrorness of mirror neurons is provided not as a function of the cell, but of the experience. So the mirrorness is given by the socio-cultural environment in which the infant grows up. It's not anti-evolutionary. So associative learning itself is it's an evolutionary adaptation. And this system is probably an adaptation for visuomotor control. What the argument is, it's not an adaptation for mirroring. So we've done a hell of a lot of research on this, and I'm hopefully not going to talk about any of it. I'm going to try and stick to evidence from outside our lab and try to explain how an associative framework can explain it really well. Let's look at some of the classic Palmer Group papers. So this is this is the original audio-visual mirror neurons. And these neurons respond both to the sound of action, to the sight of action, and to sound and sight of action. And I think what's immediately interesting is that some of the sounds that drive the response to these neurons, things like plastic crumpling or paper ripping, I mean, these sounds have not been around long enough to have been hardwired into our mirror neuron system. So there has to be a role for learning here. The monkey must have learned to associate the sound of paper ripping with this action, or with the sight of that action, or the sound of plastic crumpling. These are not going to be hardwired. Let's think about other things. So tool use mirror neurons that Vittorio has already described to us. So what's interesting, in the original papers from the Palmer group, one of the kind of control experiments they did was, let's see if these neurons respond when the monkey observes tools. And they didn't. And that was one of the original control experiments. But when the monkey had enough experience, when the monkey had observed, for instance, somebody using tools to pass them food and then reaching out to pick it up themselves, then these cells started to respond to observation of tool use. To me, that's a clear learning effect. And also the size of the mirror neuron response, the strength of mirror neuron response, correlated with the degree of experience that the monkeys had. Again, it seems to me kind of obvious that if you associate stimulant responses, you're going to get mirror neurons responding. You're going to make mirror neurons. And these type of evidence seem to really show that you can associate something which, in essence, is completely arbitrary. The sound of plastic crumpling is not intrinsic to that action. If you did polystyrene, you get a completely different sound. There's nothing intrinsic to that action, the sound of plastic crumpling. But you can associate those sounds with these actions. Let's look at some of the evidence that people claim to be against an associative view. So the kind of thing that people often say is that it can't be the case that we learn to mirror because neonates imitate. And there's been some work done by Andy Meltzoff. A lot of you will have seen this. It's from his science paper, I think, in '77, Meltzoff and Moore, which claims to show that neonates, human neonates, can imitate actions. What's interesting is that there's been quite a lot of critical work on this. So if you do a meta-analysis of this, so people like Moshe Jannisfeld, Susan Jones, done a lot of work on this. And you actually look at all the statistics, look at all the actions that were modelled, you find that there's only consistent evidence for tongue protrusion. Not mouth opening, not lip pursing, not cheek blowing. It's just tongue protrusion. Weirdly enough, you only see this response until 2 months. So let's think about it. So if the associative system, if this associative learning can give you mirror neurons flexibly, on the fly, adapted to your environment, the question is, do we need anything innate, anything hardwired? Now, you could argue that you'd only have an adaptation for inbuilt hardwired mirror neurons if they did something different, if they provided much more power than the ones that we learn. If this system is so powerful, so useful, why does it only last until the age of 2 months? Seems very weird. And I think what's even kind of more damaging to this tongue protrusion effect is that if you use exactly the Meltzoff and Moore procedure, but instead of sticking your tongue out at the infant, you play Ride of the Valkyries, or you play some other rousing classical music, or you flash disco lights, then the infant sticks its tongue out. You get exactly the same response. So the argument is that tongue protrusion is an arousal response in human infants, and they find observation of tongue protrusion arousing. Same effects have been reported in monkeys by Pier Francesco Ferrari. And what's interesting here is that, again, it seems to be only 1 or 2 movements. These things weren't differentially scored, so it's hard to work out where the effect is due. And the effect was only found at 3 days. So it's tested at 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, and 14 days. It was only found on day 3, and is only found on one of the 5 actions tested. So 5 actions, 4 days, 20 tests, only 1 was significant. So again, if associative learning can give you these things on the fly, quickly, flexibly, and you need, evolution has to have given you another really powerful system, why does it only really work at 3 days? If we take a kind of more formal look at this literature, this is every single experiment. It's a meta-analysis done by Liz Ray and Celia in 2011. This is every single experiment done on neonatal imitation. This is the range of actions. And the light bars show those studies that show positive evidence for neonatal imitation. The dark bars are the ones that show no evidence for neonatal imitation. Now, the dark bars are obviously an underestimate. It's harder to publish a null result. But even so, you can see that the only movement that actually works, again, is tongue protrusion. Let's look for positive evidence. What evidence is there that we get the kind of experience that we actually need to build mirror neurons? Well, luckily enough, there's some really good research from the 60s and 70s where the way that parents, usually mothers, interacted with their children was recorded, so purely observational. So for instance, we know that infants of kind of 2 to 3 months age, they spend the majority of their waking hours looking at their own hands. So they're continuously getting the kind of experience, self-observation experience, that would build hand mirror neurons. Also, this idea that children like looking at themselves in the mirror. Children really enjoy this. And what's strange is that they interact with their reflections socially. So they perform, for instance, emotional expressions. So they get lots of training, as it were, of performing a facial action and seeing it done. Like I said, perhaps that's quite annoying. None of these are going to work. What's actually more useful is that if you look at between 4 and 10 months, then every single minute there's an imitative episode between the caregiver and the child. And 85% of these are the mother imitating the child. And they also imitate negative affect, which is kind of weird. So when the child, screams, is angry, is disgusted, the mother mirrors this back. This was recently confirmed by Susan Jones. And also what's interesting is that parents selectively reward matching behaviour from their children. Now I think this really is kind of magical. This is a cultural effect. Parents do it, but they don't do it to build mirror neurons. They're not even aware that they're doing it. But they do. They give exactly the kind of experience that would be necessary in order to develop facial mirror neurons and to encourage this kind of matching. Another common objection, and these videos won't work either, is that this story can't be right. This link between stimuli, and action responses can't be right because animals don't imitate. And I really don't know where this idea has come from. So this is one of my favourite experiments. So in this experiment, budgerigars had a laptop sat in front of them. And they were watching videos of other budgerigars. And there was a kind of stopper here, and there was food underneath. And one group saw this budgerigar come to the stopper and use its beak to peck through it and then eat. Another group saw the budgerigar walk over to the object and use its foot to push it down, then to eat. And a day later, if you give the observer animals a chance to interact with this apparatus, if they saw beak, they're more likely to use their beak. If they saw foot, more likely to use their foot. Ludwig Huber has shown with marmosets, I think that's a marmoset, I'm not very good at monkeys, exactly the same kind of idea. So it's hard to see, but the monkey has got a film container, photographic film container, and there's food inside. And the observer monkeys either see, the demonstrator monkey either use its mouth to take the lid off, or use its paw. And again, if you give observers a chance to interact with the food container, they're likely to use their mouth if they saw a mouth, paw if they saw a paw. Also some recent research in chimps, animals can imitate. So what does this kind of mean? Well, I think one of the things that's been really interesting recently is that we've now got a huge range of mirror neurons. And I think rather than trying to understand why evolution would have given us all these different cell types, we can think of the different types of mirror neuron in terms of type of experience. So if people get lots of experience of executing and observing the same action, then you're going to get strictly congruent mirror neurons. If execution of an action is paired with a number of observed actions, then you're going to get broadly congruent mirror neurons. If you observe an action and it's specifically paired with a non-matching action, you get logically related mirror neurons. I'm not sure if everybody knows what a logically related mirror neuron is. This is a neuron that will fire, for instance, when the monkey observes the experimenter placing something on the table, so that's the observation condition, and will fire in the execution condition when the monkey kind of picks it up and maybe eats it. That's what a logically related mirror neuron is. If you observe an action that's consistently paired with observation of an object, you get a canonical neuron, a neuron that fires in response to observation of an object and execution of an action associated with that object. Inhibitory mirror neurons, they've been around actually since the De Pellegrino 92. We've seen these for a long time. If you observe an action and that's consistently paired with not executing that action, then you get inhibitory mirror neuron. As we said before, if you observe tool use, if you observe the experimenter use pliers, for instance, to reach out and put some food on the table, the monkey picks it up, then the neuron's going to start responding to tool use. So let's take all of these different types of neurons. Let's add in extrapersonal, peripersonal, view-independent, view-dependent, gaze mirror neurons, value-based mirror neurons, value-independent mirror neurons, rather than all these things being different types of cell and having to explain why evolution has given all these different types of cell and what's the adaptive value of these different types of cell. Why don't we just say that motor neurons can become associated with any stimulus? This is a controversial point, just for a laugh. If there's nothing specific to mirror neurons, this matching relationship, then there are really no mirror neurons. Mirror neurons aren't a class of thing. Yes, you do get neurons that respond when you execute an action, when you see a similar action, but they're part of a whole gamut of visuomotor control neurons, stimulus response neurons. Okay, what about function? I think the first thing to say is that if these things are not an evolutionary adaptation, then mirror neurons are not an adaptation for anything. They haven't been selected because they do anything. That doesn't necessarily mean that once an associative learning process has built them, that they're not useful for us. What it does suggest potentially is that we have an adaptation for visuomotor control. And if it's the case that our environment gives us matching experience, then we're going to have mirroring neurons. If it gives us non-matching experience, we're going to have logically related. If the environment is a bit messy, we're going to have a whole range of them. They also suggest that a particular mirror neuron is not doing the work, as it were. If a particular stimulus makes us prepare an action, imagine an action, activates a motor representation, then that neuron's going to fire, because that's what it does. That doesn't mean the neuron itself is doing the translation process. If we look at the usual claim, this action understanding claim that Vittorio explained to us, I've got some problems with this, and I think a lot of people have, because they're not really sure what action understanding is. And Vittorio's given us a kind of an idea, and there's a lot of people, people like Greg Hickok and Gergely Chibra has kind of argued against this view. I think one of the very interesting things, and Harold mentioned this, is the idea that these representations are motor. So if we go back to the tool use mirror neurons, the interesting thing about this study, and I think it's really interesting for this point, is that monkeys were trained to use reverse pliers. In the observation condition, the response of these neurons to observe grasp with the hand, pliers, and spearing, so a piece of food being stabbed, was recorded. And the authors were very, very clear to point out that the monkeys had absolutely no motor experience of spearing. They argued this shows goal understanding. The point is, if it's necessarily the case that action understanding relies on motor representations, then the firing of these mirror neurons can't have been action understanding, because they didn't have the motor program. Or, if they did, if the firing does represent action understanding, then it can't be based on motor properties, because the monkey doesn't have the motor program for spearing. But let's look at this idea that mirror neurons encode goals. So one of the things I think is really interesting is that, I'm not expecting you to read all this, don't worry, is that the way mirror neurons are described hasn't changed since the original reports. So in essence, people basically cut and paste this paragraph with a number of kind of interesting points. And a lot of these points have been argued to support the idea that mirror neurons encode goals. So the first thing is that mirror neurons don't fire if you mimic an action in monkeys or to intransitive actions. That's the first claim. Second claim is that the mirror neurons don't care what's being grasped, food or objects. Second point is that things like the size of the action, so whether the action is near or far, again, the mirror neurons don't care. They respond to goals. They don't care about things like this. Last thing is that mirror neurons show this congruence. They're either similarly or broadly congruent. So we can put those things together and get two understandings of what we mean by mirror neurons encode goals. One is that they encode object-directed actions, so transitive actions. They don't care about intransitive. The other one is that they're coding for a higher level of intention. This might be to grasp the peanut, or to grasp the peanut in order to eat. Let's look at the first one. Mirror neurons only encode object-directed actions. Well, actually, I think, again, even from, this is Vittorio's paper in 1996, we can see that, yes, it's true. If the action is intransitive, the mirror neuron fires less. So this is intransitive, this is transitive. The neuron's firing less, but it's still firing for the intransitive action. No doubt about it. In the Ferrari study, these are the mouth mirror neurons, so lip smacking, mouth opening. Again, no object there. It's an intransitive action, but you get consistent firing. Sasha Kraskov, Alexander Kraskov, 2009, Vittorio already showed this paper, 73% of the mirror neurons that they recorded also responded to pantomimed actions. So I think we have this idea that mirror neurons in monkeys don't respond to intransitive actions. It's just not true. Let's think another thing, goals as intentions. So a lot of the people that have argued that mirror neurons do higher order things, theory of mind, empathy, language, stuff like that, I had kind of some sympathy for this, for the really strictly congruent mirror neurons. The idea is that you see an action, you activate exactly that same motor program in yourself, and as long as there's a consistent predictive relationship between, for instance, execution of that action and having a higher order intention, then great. I kind of bought the argument. Wasn't sure about the data, if it's really true there's a tight relationship between execution of action and intentions, but the argument seemed fine. Interestingly now, the argument's different. So this is a quote from Rizzolatti and Sinagaglia 2010, and they make the argument that it's only neurons, mirror neurons, that encode the goal of the motor behavior at the highest level of generality that can be involved in action understanding. I mean, that's not my argument, that's their argument. So, is it really the case that any mirror neurons code high-level goals? And I think we've got lots of data on this, actually. So we've got lots of experiments now where you compare mirror neuron activity when the observer animal observes exactly the same action. So, for instance, they observe somebody reaching out, grasp a peanut with a precision grip, maybe to eat. So the high-level goal, whichever it is, whether it's to grasp a peanut, or to grasp to eat, is exactly the same in both conditions. So if mirror neurons are just encoding goals, that's all that should matter. But yet, even from Vittorio's 96 paper, we know that actually 38% of mirror neurons care whether they observe a left hand or a right hand grasping the peanut. This is a very low-level thing. 64% care whether you observe an action from the right to the left or the left to the right. Whether you're reaching from the right or left doesn't affect the intention. The intention is to grasp the peanut to eat. Whether you're reaching from right to left or left to right is irrelevant. Peripersonal and extrapersonal. Whether the monkey can reach the thing itself is irrelevant for the goal of the other monkey. The other monkey is reaching, the human in this case, is reaching out to grasp the peanut to eat. Whether the monkey itself can see it is irrelevant, but yet 53% of mirror neurons care whether the monkey can reach it itself. Viewpoint, Caggiano 11, 73% of mirror neurons care whether you see actions in the first person versus third person. Again, the goal of the observed action is the same in both cases, but 73% care about this. Recent paper again by Caggiano, 68% care whether the object grasp is food versus object. Now, even if we assume that all these things, the populations are overlapping, then at least 73% of mirror neurons are not general, as it were. And I think it's much more likely that these are not completely overlapping distributions. I think there's one population of mirror neurons that completely screws this idea up. And these, again, logically related mirror neurons. If mirror neurons allow you to put yourself in the shoes of someone else, to experience what they're experiencing, to understand from within, then logically related mirror neurons trick you. If they're coding for intention, then the intention that I've got, the monkey observes me put this thing on the table, is to release, not to eat, to let it go. The neuron fires when the monkey executes a grasp action to pick up, to eat. So logically related mirror neurons give you completely the wrong goal understanding. We say very brief things about autism and about theory of mind. So I didn't want to mention any of my work, but some of this is my stuff and Antonia's work as well. Antonia's done most of this, I'd say. I think it's really clear. If you look at behavioural evidence for mirror neuron functioning, so things like automatic imitation, and Antonia, Rachel Bridley, and Uta Frith have done not just imitation, I can't see really any consistent evidence at all. In fact, consistently no deficit in autism. There does seem to be differences on the input side. So some, for instance, people with autism might have problem in perception of biological motion. The input to the mirror system is often influenced by whether the stimulus is emotional or not. I think there's 1.5 million, isn't there? And there does seem to be deficits in this, in autism. But in actual, the behavioural evidence of mirror system function seems to be absolutely fine. And Tony's just done a fantastic review, it's in press at the moment, looking at the neuroimaging evidence. And again, this is really inconsistent. So 6 papers show mixed evidence for mirror neuron impairment. 1 shows a supernormal mirror system in autism. 12 show it's absolutely normal. 6 show it's abnormal. So there is no consistent problem. I'm going to finish on the last slide. Let's look at theory of mind. It seems to me absolutely clear, and Harold's experiment was an example of this, and Vittorio agrees, that there seems to be absolutely no contribution of the mirror system at all to theory of mind. There seem to be completely separate systems. I also don't think there's any contribution of the action mirror system to things like empathy, but we can talk about that later. In terms of theory of mind, this is a meta-analysis by Van Overwel and Batens, and it's deliberately designed to investigate this question. Does the mirror system contribute to theory of mind? The answer seems to be pretty clear. It doesn't. I think that's my time up, so thank you very much.